My dad called me his biggest regret, so I proved him wrong. A 27-year-old guy who for as long as I can remember has been the black sheep of my family. My dad, Julian, is 50, and my stepmom, Rachel, is 52. They've always made it pretty clear that my younger siblings, Tyler, 25, and Lily, 22, are the golden children. I've never fit into the family dynamic the way they do, and growing up, it always felt like my dad had a personal vendetta against me. If there was an award for being overly critical, he'd win it every year. It wasn't always blatant. Julian had a way of slipping digs into everyday conversation. If I got a B in school, he'd bring up how Tyler aced the same class. If I landed a part-time job, he'd ask why I wasn't doing internships like Lily. Rachel mostly stayed out of it, which I used to think was neutral, but I've since realized it was more like passive agreement. She was always quick to back him up if things escalated. The tipping point happened a few weeks ago during a family dinner. My family loves these get-togethers. They're more for show than actual bonding, but I try to attend when I can. We were all seated at the table and the conversation turned to careers. Tyler was boasting about a new promotion he got at work and Lily was talking about some internship she just scored. Then, it was my turn and I mentioned how I'd been doing freelance design work for a few months. That's when Julian hit me with it. He sighed dramatically, looked me dead in the eye and said, "You know, sometimes I think you're my biggest regret." The table went silent for a second, but then Tyler chuckled awkwardly and Lily mumbled something about how I should lighten up. I felt my stomach drop. I wish I could say I stood up and made a grand speech about self-worth or something, but I just sat there stunned. The worst part wasn't even the comment, it was how quickly the moment was brushed aside, like it was no big deal. Rachel poured herself another glass of wine and Tyler cracked a joke about how I always get so sensitive. Later that night, after the dinner, Tyler and Lily cornered me in the kitchen while I was grabbing leftovers to take home. They didn't waste any time mocking me. Tyler, as usual, was the ringleader, calling me a failure and asking why I couldn't just take a joke. Lily chimed in with some half-hearted agreement, clearly trying to keep the peace but still siding with him. It was like being back in high school, except now I didn't have the excuse of being a kid. I left shortly after that and didn't sleep much that night. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. It wasn't the first time Julian had said something cruel, but it felt different this time. Maybe it was because I've been trying so hard to make my freelance career work. I'm not rolling in money, but I'm proud of the work I've done. I've been building a portfolio networking and even landed a small project with a local startup. Hearing him reduce all of that to regret was a slap in the face. When I told my girlfriend Emma about what happened, she was furious on my behalf. Emma and I have been together for 3 years and she's one of the few people who's always believed in me. She didn't try to sugarcoat things or tell me to let it go. Instead, she said something that stuck with me. You can't control how your dad sees you, but you can control how much space you let him take up in your life. The next morning, I decided I was done playing along with their games. I wasn't going to let Julian's words define me anymore. I made a plan, focus on my career, set boundaries with my family, and stop looking for validation where I was never going to get it. I started small. First, I blocked Julian and Rachel on social media. They weren't the type to comment on posts, but they loved to gossip about whatever I shared, and I didn't need that negativity. I also made it a point to avoid family events unless I genuinely wanted to be there. No more guilt-tripping myself into attending out of obligation. If they wanted to see me, they'd have to make an effort to treat me with respect. I knew that wasn't likely, but just making that decision felt like a weight had been lifted. One thing that helped was a memory from when I was a kid. Back when I was maybe 10 or 11, I'd drawn a picture of our family dog. Julian had actually praised me for it, saying I had real talent. It's one of the only positive memories I have of him, but it reminded me that my creativity was mine and no one could take that away. I also turned to Reddit for advice. I wrote a post explaining the situation and the responses were overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared their own stories of toxic parents and how they'd found peace by cutting ties or setting boundaries. It was like a wake-up call. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. With Emma's encouragement, I set a new goal for myself, land a major freelance contract. Not to prove Julian wrong, but to prove to myself that I was capable. It felt like the first real step toward reclaiming my self-respect. Update 1. The first thing I did after deciding to enforce boundaries with my family was stick to my decision not to attend any family gatherings unless there was basic respect. It didn't take long for this to create waves. Julian wasted no time texting me to remind me that family is everything and that I needed to stop being dramatic. I didn't respond. A week later, Rachel called me. His tone was overly calm, the kind that immediately feels like manipulation in disguise. He suggested I'd be the bigger person and apologize to Julian to smooth things over. I told him I wasn't interested in smoothing things over anymore. That conversation ended pretty quickly. Meanwhile, I was pouring my energy into my work. A local startup reached out about a small project designing their website and branding. It wasn't a massive contract, but it was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been looking for. I threw myself into the work, spending late nights sketching out ideas and refining mock-ups. When I sent over the final designs, they were thrilled. It wasn't just about the paycheck, though that part didn't hurt. It was the confidence boost I needed. Julian didn't see it that way. He must have heard about my project through the grapevine because a few days later, I started getting more texts. This time, it was about how I was abandoning the family and letting my ego get in the way. I didn't reply, but Tyler stepped in to take his side. He started sending me sarcastic messages asking if my big break was enough to pay the bills and calling me a loser for cutting ties with the only people who actually care about you. I blocked him. Emma, on the other hand, was a rock. She sat down with me and helped me organize my time so I could juggle a few smaller freelance gigs alongside the startup project. I'd always been good at the creative side of things, but she showed me how to stay on top of deadlines and client communication. With her help, I started building a portfolio that I could be proud of. I spent weeks networking online, joining forums, and even taking on a couple of pro bono projects to showcase my skills. One of those connections turned out to be a gold mine. A Redditor who'd seen my original post about my family reached out with a lead on a high-paying freelance opportunity. It was for a marketing campaign with a mid-sized national company. I jumped on it immediately, and after a few rounds of proposals, they hired me. It was a $15,000 project, the biggest I'd ever landed, and I couldn't believe how quickly things were turning around. Of course, Julian wasn't happy about any of this. He started spreading rumors to our extended family saying I was lazy and ungrateful. My aunt called me out of the blue one afternoon, clearly hesitant, but trying to understand my side of the story. When I told her what had been happening, she admitted she'd heard similar stories from Julian for years. That was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also made me realize how deeply ingrained this narrative had become. Around this time, Emma suggested I try therapy. She said it might help me unpack all the years of emotional abuse and figure out how to move forward without letting my family's toxicity hold me back. I'd never seriously considered therapy before, but I made an appointment. During the first session, I started to see just how much of my life had been shaped by trying to win Julian's approval, a losing battle from the start. Lily, meanwhile, decided to get involved. She sent me a long message accusing me of being selfish and saying Julian had always been right about you. It stung, but I didn't respond. I wasn't going to get dragged into more pointless arguments. Blocking her felt like the healthiest option, so I did. Despite all the family drama, my Reddit posts kept gaining traction. Strangers were commenting with their own stories of toxic parents and how they'd found freedom by setting boundaries. It was validating in a way I hadn't expected. One person even said my story inspired them to go no contact with their own dad. That kind of support made the constant barrage from my family feel less overwhelming. Finishing the $15,000 project was a turning point. The client left a glowing review and even recommended me to another company. With the money I earned, I was able to pay off a lingering debt that had been hanging over me for years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. While sorting through some old boxes in my apartment, I came across a childhood journal I'd forgotten about. Flipping through it was like opening a time capsule. There were sketches of imaginary worlds and notes about projects I wanted to create someday. It was a reminder of the kid I used to be, the one who loved drawing and designing before all the comparisons and criticism started. That memory gave me the motivation to keep moving forward no matter how messy things got with my family. Update 2. Completing the $15,000 project felt like crossing a major milestone. Not only did the client leave a glowing review, but they also recommended me to another company, which led to more inquiries about my work. Things were finally looking up and I was gaining momentum. I updated my portfolio with a new project, shared it on a few professional platforms, and started planning my next steps. Meanwhile, Julian was still running his smear campaign. He told anyone who would listen that my so-called success was fake and accused me of lying about my accomplishments. One of my cousins sent me a screenshot of a group chat where Julian claimed I exaggerated my earnings and was living off Emma. It was frustrating, but I chose not to engage. If anything, it only solidified my decision to stay low contact. Not everyone bought into his narrative though. My grandfather, Julian's dad, called me out of the blue. We hadn't talked much in recent years because Julian often controlled the flow of family communication. But Grandpa told me he'd heard about my work and wanted me to know how proud he was. He even mentioned how he'd always seen the potential in me, even when others didn't. That call came at the perfect time. It was the first genuine support I'd received from a family member in years, and it meant more than I can put into words. Emma and I celebrated that night with takeout and a lot of brainstorming. She suggested I think about investing in my own design studio. The idea was daunting, but it sparked something in me. We talked about turning it into a space where I could work on larger projects and eventually collaborate with other designers. It felt like a pipe dream, but Emma had a way of making it sound achievable. Therapy was another area where progress was happening. During one session, I started connecting the dots about how much of my life had been driven by a need for validation, specifically from Julian. My therapist helped me see that his approval was something I was never going to get and that my worth didn't depend on it. It was a hard truth to accept, but it was also freeing. Of course, Tyler wasn't happy about any of this. He found out about my $15,000 project and immediately started downplaying it. He told mutual friends I was lucky to have landed the job and implied I didn't have the talent to keep up that level of success. I didn't confront him directly, but when he tried to message me about it, I told him to stay out of my business. That was the last time we spoke. With Emma's help, I started putting together a plan for the studio. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but I set realistic goals, save a specific amount of money, scout locations, and slowly build a client base that could sustain the overhead. It was exciting to think about. And for the first time in a while, I felt like I was working towards something bigger than myself. Meanwhile, I made my decision to formally go low contact with Julian and Rachel. I sent them an email explaining that I wouldn't be attending any family gatherings or engaging with them unless there was mutual respect. Predictably, Julian responded with a passive-aggressive message about how I was tearing the family apart. I didn't reply. His smear campaign, however, started to backfire. Several family members reached out to me privately saying they didn't believe the things Julian was saying. A couple of them even apologized for not stepping in sooner. It was a small but meaningful shift, and it gave me hope that not everyone in the family had been drinking Julian's Kool-Aid. Things took another unexpected turn when my work was featured in a local magazine. One of my previous clients had nominated me for a Rising Creative Spotlight, and the magazine did a full write-up about my journey as a freelance designer. I didn't think much of it until I heard through the grapevine that Julian and Rachel had seen the article. Apparently, it had surprised them, but I wasn't about to reach out and ask what they thought. Tyler, however, was livid. During a family gathering I didn't attend, he reportedly had a meltdown accusing me of stealing his spotlight. It was ironic since I wasn't even there, but it confirmed what I'd always suspected. Tyler thrived on being the golden child, and any deviation from that narrative rattled him. Emma, being the amazing partner she is, decided to throw me a surprise party to celebrate all the progress I'd made. She invited a few close friends and even decorated the place with little nods to my design work. It was a simple but meaningful gesture, and it reminded me of how far I'd come with the right support system. The cherry on top came a few days later when my grandfather sent me a package. Inside was an old sketch I'd made as a kid, framed beautifully with a note that read, "Always believed in you." It brought back memories of a time when creativity was something I loved for its own sake, not something tied to proving anyone wrong. To top it all off, my Reddit posts started gaining even more traction. People were sharing them on other platforms, and I started getting messages from strangers thanking me for inspiring them to cut toxic ties. Some even told me they'd started their own journeys toward independence after reading my updates. It was surreal to think my story could have that kind of impact, but it also felt like the ultimate vindication. As I sat in my apartment that night, looking at my childhood sketch and reading through the supportive comments online, I couldn't help but feel like I was finally rising above everything that had held me down for so long. Update 3. Not long after my work got featured in the local magazine, Julian decided to escalate things. He sent me a long email demanding I apologize for ruining his reputation. Apparently, his smear campaign wasn't going as planned, and some family members were starting to side with me. Julian framed his ultimatum as a way to repair the family, but it was clear he was more worried about how he looked. He ended the email with a not-so-subtle threat. If I didn't apologize, he'd disown me. I read it twice, then closed my laptop and went about my day. Later, I replied with a short, straightforward message. "I don't need your approval anymore." That was it. No drama. No explanations. I'd learned by now that trying to reason with Julian was a waste of time. Things got worse when Tyler decided to involve himself. Out of nowhere, I started getting messages from people in my professional circle about a string of screenshots Tyler had posted online. He'd leaked private messages we'd exchanged years ago, twisting them to make it look like I was arrogant and unprofessional. Most of the people who reached out could see through it, but the fact that he tried to sabotage me was a new low even for him. At the same time, I was making moves to expand my work. With Emma's encouragement, I rented a small co-working space as a test run for my eventual studio. It wasn't much, just a shared office with enough room for a desk, a drafting table, and some basic equipment, but it felt like a step in the right direction. I started hosting casual workshops for local creatives, and the response was better than I expected. Within a few weeks, I had a regular group of people coming in to collaborate and learn from each other. Back on the family front, things took an unexpected turn. Lily called me out of the blue. She was upset, and for the first time, it wasn't aimed at me. Apparently, she'd confronted Julian during a family dinner. She told him point blank that I'd been treated unfairly for years and that the way he spoke about me was cruel and unnecessary. According to Lily, the conversation ended with Julian storming out of the room. It was hard to believe Lily was finally seeing things clearly, but it felt like progress. Therapy was also starting to pay off. I'd reached a point where I could talk about my family without feeling overwhelmed or bitter. My therapist helped me recognize that I didn't need to fix or change anyone, only myself. That perspective shift made it easier to focus on my goals without getting bogged down by the constant drama. Speaking of drama, Tyler's life seemed to be unraveling. His career, which had always been his bragging point, hit a rough patch. He lost a major client due to some careless mistakes, and his boss wasn't happy. A few days later, he reached out to me asking for advice. I kept my response simple. I'm not in a position to help. It wasn't about revenge or pettiness. I just wasn't going to let him use me after everything he'd done. Grandpa, as always, was a voice of reason. During one of our phone calls, he reminded me that grudges only hold you back. He wasn't pushing me to reconcile with Julian or Tyler. He just wanted me to stay focused on my future. It was advice I took to heart. Meanwhile, the co-working space started to gain traction. Word of mouth spread quickly and I was getting inquiries from local businesses interested in renting it for events. It became a hub for creatives, and I started to feel like I'd found my niche. Emma, ever the planner, suggested we take things a step further. She proposed that we move in together to cut down on costs and give me more flexibility to invest in the space. It wasn't a hard decision to make. We've been talking about it for a while and this felt like the perfect time. While my professional life was thriving, Julian was spiraling. He took to social media to vent about me, posting long rants about how ungrateful I was and how he'd sacrificed everything for me. Most people ignored it, but a few family members reached out to tell me how embarrassing it was to watch. Some even decided to cut ties with him altogether, siding with me instead. The final turning point came with the grand opening of my design studio. After months of hard work, I was able to upgrade from the co-working space to a dedicated studio of my own. Emma helped me plan a small launch party and I invited some of the clients and collaborators who'd supported me along the way. It was a surreal moment, standing in that space and realizing how far I'd come. Grandpa sent me a handwritten note that night congratulating me and reminding me how proud he was. I framed it and placed it on my desk as a reminder of his unwavering support. By this point, Julian's attempts to control the narrative no longer mattered. His threats, rants, and manipulations had lost their power. I didn't need his approval or anyone else's to feel like I was enough. For the first time in years, I felt free. Update 4. Not long after my studio officially opened, things started to unravel for Julian in ways I hadn't expected. The family had finally grown tired of his behavior, and the stories he'd been spreading about me began to backfire. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, letting me know Julian's reputation within the family was taking a hit. He doubled down on his accusations against me during a family gathering, only to be met with pushback from several aunts and uncles. People were finally starting to see through his manipulation, and it wasn't a good look for him. As the backlash against Julian grew, Tyler made his next move. Out of nowhere, he sent me a text apologizing for his behavior. He said he wanted to put everything behind us and move forward, but it was clear his apology was more about damage control than genuine remorse. I didn't respond. At this point, I wasn't interested in rekindling relationships that had brought me nothing but negativity. Around the same time, I had a major breakthrough in therapy. After months of digging into my past and understanding the impact of my family dynamics, I finally felt strong enough to step away from therapy. My therapist agreed, saying I had made incredible progress and seemed ready to continue growing on my own. It wasn't the end of my healing journey, but it was a big milestone that felt like a personal victory. Meanwhile, my extended family started showing their support more openly. Several aunts and uncles reached out to tell me how proud they were of everything I'd accomplished. One aunt even shared that she'd always known Julian was harsh on me, but hadn't felt it was her place to intervene. Hearing that was bittersweet, but I appreciated her honesty. For the first time, it felt like I had a support network beyond Emma and a few close friends. The studio, on the other hand, was thriving. I landed my first six-figure client, a massive branding project for a national company, and it was a game changer. The financial stability this provided allowed me to hire a small team and expand the studio's services. We went from working on local projects to pitching ideas to companies I'd only dreamed of collaborating with. The growth was surreal, but it also reinforced that I was on the right path. As my professional life soared, Julian's isolation deepened. He began losing the support of his social circle as more people heard about how he treated me over the years. Rachel, ever the passive player in all this, quietly distanced herself from the drama. According to my cousin, she barely spoke up when people confronted Julian about his behavior, letting him face the fallout alone. It seemed like the cracks in their dynamic were starting to show. Tyler wasn't doing much better. His career continued to struggle and his relationship with his girlfriend reportedly ended after a massive argument. Family gossip pinned a lot of Tyler's frustrations on Julian's favoritism, which had clearly left him unprepared to handle adversity. It was a strange turn of events, but I stayed out of it. His choices weren't my responsibility. Lily, however, surprised me again. She reached out to apologize for her past behavior, admitting she'd been blind to how unfairly I'd been treated. Her message felt genuine, and while I wasn't ready to fully rebuild our relationship, I appreciated the effort. It was a small step, but it showed that change was possible, even in the most dysfunctional family dynamics. Emma, being the incredible partner she is, organized a celebration to mark 1 year since the studio's launch. She invited close friends, clients, and even a few of the people I'd met through Reddit who had become part of my support system. It was a night filled with laughter, gratitude, and a sense of accomplishment. Emma's unwavering belief in me had been a cornerstone of my journey, and celebrating together felt like the perfect way to honor how far we'd come. To top it all off, my story was featured in a national publication as part of a series on entrepreneurs who overcame adversity. The article highlighted not just my professional success, but also the personal challenges I'd faced along the way. It brought in a wave of new opportunities and solidified the studio's reputation in the industry. I couldn't have asked for a better way to close this chapter of my life. And then came Julian's letter. He sent it through Grandpa, asking him to pass it along since I'd blocked Julian on every platform. In the letter, Julian pleaded for reconciliation, saying he regretted how things had turned out and wanted a chance to make things right. It was hard to know how much of it was sincere and how much was just damage control after losing his social circle. Either way, I didn't respond. I'd made peace with the fact that I didn't need closure from Julian to move forward. Emma and I started planning a trip to Europe, a long overdue adventure that would be the perfect way to leave the toxicity of my past behind. We mapped out an itinerary, booked tickets, and set a goal to focus on nothing but the future. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed. From being the family's scapegoat to building a life I'm proud of, the journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Julian's downfall was never my goal, but it became an inevitable consequence of his actions. As I sit in my studio surrounded by the life I've built, I can finally say I found peace. Not through anyone else's validation, but through my own growth and resilience. Update 5. The past year has been a whirlwind. My design studio has gone from a small operation to a thriving business, and we've even started earning recognition in the industry. Last month, we won an award for Innovative Creative Studio of the Year, which opened the door to partnerships with even bigger clients. What started as a solo freelance hustle has now grown into a full-fledged company with a small but talented team. It feels surreal to say it, but the studio is officially a success. As my professional life reached new heights, Julian and Rachel made a few more attempts to reach out. Julian tried to get in touch through mutual relatives, dropping hints that he wanted to reconnect. Rachel stayed true to form, avoiding confrontation but sending vague messages through others about how family should stick together. I didn't engage.